Good morning everyone. Self Assistant Professor Shruti Das having this talk show in the event of Kesariwada Ganesh Utsav. Now today's topic for discussion is cybercrime investigation, digital evidence and data privacy. Now to expand our knowledge in this horizon, we have three stalwarts with us, Mr. Sunil Ramanand, Dr. Swapnil Bangali and Dr. Harold DeCosta. Now let me introduce with you our three experts. Dr. Swapnil Bangali is a practicing advocate and freelance academician. He has a teaching experience of more than 13 years and he is a founding partner of S Square Legal Pune, working partner of Cybera Legal Services and associate partner ADR Savvy Pune. Sir has expertise in the field of cybercrime investigation and digital evidence. Sir has also authored a book in this area, law relating to contravention under the Information Technology Act 2000, apart from various national and international journals published. Mr. Sunil Ramanand sir is additional DGP and ID Prisons Maharashtra. He was Inspector General of Police CID Maharashtra. He has joined the Allied Indian Police Service in 1994. Sir has been Additional Commissioner of Police when 26/11 terror attack happened in Mumbai. Sir has various awards. To mention a few, he has awarded the Police Medal by the Principal of by the President of India for and received the UN Medal for Peacekeeping in Kosovo 2003-04. Sir has also authored a book titled Cops in Quagmire. Dr. Harold DeCosta is the President, Cyber Security Corporation, CEO, Intelligent Quotient Security System. He is advisor in law enforcement agencies and senior consultant and trainer. He is an international trainer in cybercrime investigation and he has trained more than 40,000 cops and 8,500 judges. Sir has also helped in solving 6,000 cases relating to cybercrime. Sir has co-authored more than 15 research papers in cybercrime space. And sir is also a regular writer in national newspapers. Now we will start our session with questioning Mr. Sunil Ramanand sir. Sir, as the session starts with cybercrime investigation, I would like to ask you the question that what is cybercrime? What are the types of cybercrime?
Thank you so much to begin with for having me over. It is a matter of privilege for me to be here this morning. Thanks to the college authorities and three of my teachers who are very much here listening to me, which is rather intimidating for me to speak while I am talking in a jocular way. Well, I'd like to club this question with not just investigation of cyber crimes, but also with investigation as a policeman understands it. I would like to confine myself to a policeman's perspective on investigation of cyber crimes. Now, Indian policeman is a very typical species and his investigative approach differs to a great extent vis-a-vis European and American counterparts. I'll tell you what I mean by this. See, the investigative approach of an Indian policeman is one size fits all. For example, you may have a situation wherein today a policeman may be called upon to investigate a murder case. The next day he may be asked to investigate an economic offences. Thereafter he may be asked to work as an active traffic policeman, and maybe subsequently he may be also called upon to investigate a cyber offence. So does he really have to be a jack of all trades? Well, I would prefer to call him a master jack. He should know practically every single aspect of investigation of multiple types of offences which indeed according to me is a very tall order. So how does the Indian policeman accommodate all of this? What has an Indian investigator done in the furtherance of honing his capacities to investigate cybercrime? Well, in order to answer all these questions, we have to very briefly browse through the history of investigative processes in India, and only then will we be in a position to appreciate and analyze the complexity and the very unusual problems that an Indian investigator faces while investigating cyber offences. Now, I'll start with the year 1960, when the Indian Penal Code was enacted by the British, and it was from there, and subsequent to which were enacted the Code of Criminal Procedure and also Indian Evidence Act, which form the bedrock of criminal investigation in this particular country. Now, what is IPC at the end of the day? IPC is a law that defines crimes or offences and prescribes punishments. So it essentially is a substantive law. Now, what does a criminal, how did the Indian police then go about with investigation with the aid of these particular laws? Well, as it is very rightly said, through the investigation and prosecution is done through the medium of evidence. Now, it's very important to distinguish between evidence and proof. Evidence is a medium, a vehicle to prove or disprove facts, as they say. So what it essentially means is that an Indian policeman investigating offences, we are not talking about the erstwhile era, will also come up to the current era. He is expected to collect evidences in furtherance of building up a case which would eventually lead to prosecution and hopefully successful conviction. Now, what is evidence at the end of the day? What do you mean by evidence? Well, evidence, in order to know what evidence is, you have to look up at two laws. The first of which is the Indian Evidence Act 1872. Indian Evidence Act talks about evidences of two kinds. One is oral evidence and the other one is the documentary evidence. Oral evidence is essentially the deposition of witnesses in courts of law. So basically he looks for witnesses whose statements he would record, get them to the court of law, they would be summoned there, and then they would under oath speak there, which would be taken on record as evidence. The second is documentary evidence. Documentary evidence is basically about documents. It could be a sale deed, will, invoices, bus tickets, blah 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 blah. Document has been very appropriately defined. Now the CRPC, mind here, also talks about the third kind of evidence, which is called material evidence. Material evidence typically means a knife used by a murderer to kill somebody, a gun used, a club used, a hammer, a vehicle used in a crime, so on and so forth. So to us Indian policemen, I am talking about the old era, we only knew evidences of three kinds. Oral evidences, which involves, which was about witnesses deposing in the courts of law, documentary evidence or documents, and third is material evidence. Now, what were the kind of offences that the policeman was very typical and very frequently called upon to investigate from 1960 till close to the 20th century? Predominantly these are body offences, property offences, and to a certain extent economic offences, which basically revolved around criminal breach of trust and falsification of documents, that is creation of false documents or forged documents with a view to cheating. And this is what the entire machinery was geared up from 1960 to close to 140 years. If you look at police manuals which run into volumes, this is the only thing that has been talked about. Offences like theft, robbery, extortion, dacoity, body offences like simple hurt, attempt to murder, grievous hurt, and stuff of this sort. So the policeman was essentially trained to investigate these offences, and the evidences that he was meant to collect of these three kinds were very tangible, very palpable, very clear to the human senses.
So time rolled on and all, and then certain changes started happening in the early 80s. It was in the early 80s that computers as an electronic device began getting introduced in a modest way, of course, not in a big way, in academia. Initially, people would deal with punched cards, then there came mainframe computers with keyboards and PCs and so on and so forth, and the academia was getting used to it. There were, of course, certain problems such as virus attacks, which would corrupt data, hang computers, and stuff of that sort. With the advent of the 1990s, the computer systems got complex. Not only that, the society, Indian society in particular, and of course the Western society, was introduced in a big way to what is called internet, LAN and internet. Initially computers were connected. Earlier a person would work with a single computer and a keyboard with possibly floppy devices and other storage devices as add-ons or as adjuncts. But with the advent of internet, the world became a global village. Sitting here in Pune, you could instantaneously send an email to wherever you wanted to. I still recall in the early 90s, 1991, 92, so to speak, you know, it was a matter of fascination for science students to know that there is a certain center somewhere from where you can send an email to your friend in America. You won't really have to pick up a pen and paper and scribble your thoughts there and, you know, stick it and put it in a post box. So this was quite revolutionary. But there were some problems associated with all this. Once things got connected, there was a great and distinct possibility of the other fellow getting access to your device. So whereas there were umpteen advantages, there were some unseen problems like this that started cropping up. Then came your Microsoft Word, and there was further upgradation, and then data available in computers also started acquiring forms, as a layman would say. You would have a Word file, you would have a JPG, you would have a PDF, you would have a video, you would have an access file and an access file plus access to internet and emails. Things were getting complex. And with this complexity in matters, certain malpractices started became very glaring. People entering your system, stealing your data, corrupting your data, so on and so on. There are umpteen such problems which I would not, I won't labor this point. And it was at this juncture that it was felt to bring in a law to regulate all these matters. And it was in this backdrop that in the year 2000, the Information Technology Act was enacted, and the police investigator who for the last 140 years was investigating these very typical kind of offences, collecting very typical kind of evidences with which he was extremely comfortable, and he would do it at the drop of his hat, was called upon to investigate offences under the IT Act of 2000. Now mind well, IT Act of 2000 is not per se a penal act. It is more a regulatory framework of which there are certain penal portions. Now what was essentially done here is, according to me, all these malpractices were now declared criminal offences, and these were incorporated in a certain chapter which runs from section 65 to 78, and plus you had an additional section 43 which also said that these malpractices would be offences. I would not prefer to labor this point because we all know it is nothing new. And then the investigator said, now but this is it, you start investigating this offence, and the poor policeman was totally at sea. Because with the creation of a virtual world, he could not really correlate to it. And it was here now that a fourth kind of evidence got introduced. So we had three earlier for 140 years, and now digital evidence or electronic data as evidence was introduced by the amendment of law. Now virtual world is a very tricky word. See, this is what is oft said, that with the advent of internet, geography became history. Your physical location became immaterial because you began committing crimes in a make-believe world which we call the virtual world. So where you were physically stationed and all became rather immaterial, and all the electronic data is very intangible. It slips through your fingers if you're not good enough. So now that it was felt that even the common investigator, the master jack, needs to hone his skills. He should also be taught to collect electronic evidence and conduct his investigation and successfully prosecute the matter. Now when he actually began doing his job, he ran into rough data, if I may use the term, because there are some certain very unforeseen problems that cropped up. First and foremost, he needed the assistance of experts. Experts as we define under section 45 of the Indian Evidence Act, people who have specialized knowledge in blah 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 blah. So the first thing he realized is that he couldn't survive without the assistance of an expert. So the expert became the tail that began wagging the dog called the investigator. It's very unusual. If you understand what I mean. The tail began wagging the dog now here. And simultaneously, we also needed a brand of prosecutors who would also understand investigation, collection of digital or electronic evidence. Now, a very large number of laws also got amended, including the Indian Evidence Act, to incorporate all of this. So now there is also an investigator. Now the Indian system is a very typical system, unlike the American system. See what happens, there are certain systems in the Western world wherein whenever a criminal case is reported and registered, not only is the investigator appointed, it is called the prosecutor's case. It's not the investigator's case. So what does the investigator do? The investigator acts as a technical hand. So it is the prosecutor who decides upon the nitty-gritties of the case, and the policeman is like a technical hand to him. Indian law does not envisage any such thing. In the Indian system, the prosecutor is the king. The IO is the king. The IO can overrule a prosecutor. The advice tendered to an IO by a prosecutor can be overruled by the IO. The IO is the king when it comes to investigation. But then when such things began happening, there were some bright quote-unquote brains who said, no, let us appoint a prosecutor right from the word go. So let us have an investigator and a prosecutor. Now the prosecutor, right, so did the IT expert, and this hodgepodge took some time to settle. Let me be very honest with you. So thinking aloud, maybe in offences of this sort, cyber crimes in particular, we may like toy with the idea of having a law which permits the association of a prosecutor right from the beginning, though the normal Indian law does not permit any such thing. Now, collection of electronic data. I'll tell you what will happen initially to begin with. See, an IO, he is asked to first search for electronic evidence, collect the electronic evidence, and introduce it into the court at the time of trial. Three very distinct, very tricky things. And IO gets, I'm giving you very typical examples. Once again, very anecdotal. See, he enters into a room which is full of computers, hard disk, this, that, and the other. So the poor chap is using to murder scenes and theft scenes. So he says, Panchanama, uthalo. So the thing is picked up and carried to the police station. And then, not all though, but some IOs have this, they can't resist the desire to play around and fidget with the computer device the way a child likes to do with a toy. So he may switch it on and switch it off and turn it over and this, that and the other. Now what would initially happen is the Panchanama would say that I sealed this particular hard disk device blah blah at 3 in the evening, but at the time of trial it was realized that it had been switched on at 4. The case fell flat on its face. So the issues of not only were the issues of admissibility of evidence, digital evidence, but the credibility of that evidence also came under a cloud. So evidence was being collected, evidence was brought to the court, but the integrity of the evidence came under a cloud because of certain issues raised by gentlemen like them who would say, see, I have evidence to suggest that the thing seized yesterday switched on today. So what about the integrity of the evidence? So then the IO had to be trained. Arey, aisa mat karo, what to do? So then some police officer said, teach them hash value. So now what is hash value? Something very bombastic term. No. So one of the I'm just citing an example here. One senior police officer said, when you record a statement of a witness, do it in front of a video camera and the IO should obtain the hash value and then also submit the CD or the device along with the statement recorded to the court saying, see, I have recorded the hash value here and I have not tampered with it. So this is to communicate to the court that no tampering has happened. Now poor IO could never do it. He didn't know how to do it. Some tried, failed. Then somebody said, no, you are not experts under section 45 of the Indian Evidence Act. Read 45, 45A also. Said, you should call me. Again, I will be the bully tail that would wag the dog, call the investigator. I will do it without me or nobody. So I'll come in, I'll obtain the hash value and then I will do this, that and the other. And now then suddenly somebody said, no, you also have to give a certificate under section 65B. Now who gives it? You get a format. Then somebody said, hey, Arupi se le lo. Then someone else, no. Yes, he has protection, he has right not to self-incriminate him under the Constitution of India. So who used it? So again confusion. So it was a cauldron full of motley assorted elements pulling in different directions, and many things still remain very fuzzy, very hazy, very nebulous. So I give my example. I said, boss, let us not try to use our brain. When you see a device, just pack it and send it to the forensic lab. Don't finger it. Don't try to switch it on. Don't try to say, "Isme kya hai dekhte hain?" We don't understand. I said, I don't understand hash value. Don't try to understand it. That 65, we will see that, but don't play with the things, send it there. So long and short is, these three challenges still remain. Looking for digital evidence, collecting digital evidence, and piloting the evidence in course of a trial in a manner that it is admissible and credible. So these are some of the very important areas of cyber investigation. I think I would say it would be in the fitness of things to have laws that would address these problems, and there are quite a few cyber crimes. There's a long list, if you want, I'll very quickly read it out. Identity theft, now policemen never had, how do you steal identity theft, hacking and phishing and wishing and this thing and that thing. So it's a long list. I don't think I think that they would be in a better position to shed some light on this. And so what the government also subsequently did is, now a cyber police station has been set up in every single district of the state. Applications come by the dozens, but registration of offences, few and far between, I would say. And so we are still learning. We need to learn more. We need some robust laws which would formalize the role of prosecutors at the stage of investigation. See, what happens in the Indian system is, a prosecutor comes into play only after the case is sent to the court. There is no law whatsoever that really permits him to play a role, though some such attempts have been made in the past. So this is, in my opinion, the gist of it. And well, somebody once also mentioned that even the IT Act now needs overhaul. Like this is what he's been saying, that stuff like your Bitcoin and all, these don't cover under IT Act anymore. It's been the prosecution is taking place under section 420 of the Indian Penal Code. So these are some of the issues I feel are relevant and pertinent for a policeman who acts as an investigator.
Sir, in the same connection, I will say when the police basically comes up with a case, before it goes to the police station, we have to understand that as an individual has been attacked. How do I ask you, Harold sir, that how do an individual understand that the person has been attacked? Because if a lot of time passes between the attack happened and the person realizes, then the attacker can go anywhere. So how do a person understand that the attack has happened?
See, I think the first point of view, is when we do talk about cybercrime specifically on this topic, we should understand from a larger gamut what cybercrime is all about. In a very simplistic and a very generalistic word, or a term, I would say that whenever technology is being misused to do any illegal activity, so it can be termed as a cybercrime. That's the first part. The second thing is that how does a person know that he or she has been attacked by this digital warfare? You see, today we have almost about 70 crore Indians today using internet. In a country with an estimated population of 138 crores, almost about 70 crores using internet. We almost have about 92 to 93 crore debit cards. We almost have about 120 crore SIM cards used in India. Of course, some of them may be having 2 or 3 SIM cards. All said and done, when you have such type of a digital revolution, it's most important that citizens or a common person should understand how to use this digitized space in a more hygienic manner. We have, Swachh Bharat Abhiyan, very nice concept. But I think in today's context, we should have Swachh Internet Abhiyan. Because having the internet to be Swachh means that people won't get victimized to a larger extent. Now, how do you make a person know that he or she has been attacked? That's your primary question. I'll give you a small example. There are hundreds of tools which are available on the internet space, wherein a mail can be originated from anybody's email ID without knowing his or her email ID's password. So under that point of view, an email comes to me, say from your email ID. And the person who has sent this, he doesn't know what your password is all about. He may be just having your identity card, that is your visiting card, on which your email ID has been specified. He uses that email ID, goes on to some certain tools which are freely available on the internet, because the cyberspace is still not properly guarded. And of course, as we have one of the topics, that a data privacy policy is still not being there in place. So under these circumstances, what happens is that an email will come to me from your email ID, and I will think that it has been sent by you. And if that email contains some confidential information, I may part the confidential information via sending an email back to you. But when I'm replying that email back to you, it will not go to you, even though your email ID is specified as in the from. It will go to some XYZ person. And that XYZ person may misuse that information for committing a crime. What to be done under these circumstances? You know, we have been talking about digital signatures in our country for a long time. Most of the government systems use digital signature in terms of tendering of documents. They use digital signature. Why not this digital signature to be made as a common tool for each and every person, for example, who has an email ID? What will happen is that if I am getting an email from your email ID, and if I don't have something called as a green tick mark or a green mark just next to your email ID, it will suggest to me that it has been sent by you only. Whenever an email has been sent from any spoofed server or by using some hacking tool, that particular email ID won't have a green tick mark next to the email ID, which will make me aware that this is not the genuine email which has come from the right person to me. Now today we don't have. So because we don't have, we have the potential, India as a country, we have the potential to become a largest victim of cybercrime. There are, as what has been rightly said, is that there are n number of complaints which have been made. Hardly few of them are registered as an FIR, and hardly few of them lead into prosecution or the conviction point of view. So if there are some good cyber hygiene practices in place, wherein, as one of the example I just quoted to you, we can ensure that a person will come to know a green tick mark next to the email ID from the from sender will signify to me that it is a genuine email. If that green tick mark is not there to the next of the email ID, I will understand that this is a spoofed one and I will prevent that attack, and I won't give any information related to what is being asked in that. Number two, an attack, financial frauds. Huge. In last year, between March 2020 to June 2020, in that 3 months time, I had almost about 751 cases coming to me. And most of these cases were related to the cyber financial fraud. Now this is basically done through phishing link. You know, people sitting at home, they were not having any work. So most of the time, they used to spend their time on the digital device. I remember in one of the conference, the Union IT Minister then said, an average Indian used to spend 3 hours 47 minutes on his mobile phone on the social media sites. Believe me, this statistics is of 2018 November. It's almost 1 year and few months, 1 year, 7-8 months. I am sure that 3 hours 47 minutes might have gone to 5 hours or 5.5 hours, per day. An average Indian I am talking about. If you go to the urban side, I feel that an average may be spending about 8 to 9 hours per day. So under these circumstances, people are glued to their mobile phone. So during this time, if I get a link on my mobile phone saying that there is some Pradhan Mantri Yojana scheme under which I will get some certain money into my account, because as of now I am not a earning member. So I will click on that link. But the moment I click on that link, as what I said to you on the email ID, moment I click on that particular website, if I get some indication as a green arrow or a green tick mark, I will know that this phishing link is a genuine. Otherwise, I know that this is a fake. Now let me tell you, from technological perspective, it's not a rocket science. It's not a rocket science. So whenever you have a phishing link, it has to be concluded that it has to come from a registered domain for which all the compliance procedures have been done. So if this is there in place, I am sure that people may not get victimized to some certain Ponzi schemes and lose the money. Many of the phishing frauds, especially the financial frauds, could be averted, and people will know that okay, this phishing link is not the one which I should go on with. All in all, I would sum it up and say cyber hygiene is the need of the hour for every single Indian, to that matter to every single user who uses technology in this particular geographical world wherever they are in. If these are in place, I would say that not only they will know that they are being attacked, I would say that the police also will find lesser number of cases coming to them, and whatever the lesser number of cases coming to them, the conviction rate also can marginally improve, and that can become as a benchmark for the criminals. Look, the law enforcement agencies are too long, they can catch you, there is a law in place for which the punishment for you would be a larger one to be there.
Thank you, sir. Sir, now Swapnil Bangali sir, I will just like to ask you, once a case comes to you as you are a practitioner, what is your initial response? What is the procedure you follow generally when a cybercrime case comes to you?
Okay, see what happens usually is that, you know, when money is lost or something which is really a matter of personal right getting violated, or probably somewhere some obscene act takes place, usually the first response would be that you should first look at how exactly the thing has been done. And naturally it's all hovering around either some kind of an email or probably a mobile number or probably a device. And the immediate response would be that please don't play with it. Already, I think Ramanan sir has already said it, that we primarily say that we should not be playing with the device, because, you know, the problem in India, or probably it's the, you know, the entire universe is facing the same problem. We are having devices with which we are not properly equipped with the, you know, what exactly has been into that device. I think an average Indian, probably only 30 or 32% of the people actually know what is available in their device. You know, there are too many functionalities which have not been explored, not been known, and it's almost like, you know, they are adding on to that crime what has been actually done to them. And my personal experience is like, you know, already they know that it's all because of the Bluetooth or probably some kind of a data being open, network being open, and still they are continuing with the same mistake again. Today, if I am having my device affected by something, it should be my usual practice to shut it off. I should keep it off. But that temptation, I will, you know, use my own metrics. I know I am using this device for last 2 years, so I know everything about it. That leads to a problem. And I think it's almost like saying that, you know, I know my pet very well, but the problem is that pet is a pet. It's an animal. It might bark, it might bite me. It's not about knowing the psyche, or it's not being, you know, there as a principal agent understanding device. So I always found it very fascinating that even when you know that it might lead you to trouble, and still you are thinking that I still can manage with it, this attitude sometimes would lead to a trouble. So my usual advice is that, you know, look at the device first, understand the device first, and then use it. See, practically law courts will never accept any such defense that, see, I didn't do it, you know, my device did it. There is no defense like this. You are contributing into the mistakes, it will lead you to trouble. And usually I sense it like this, that, you know, what happens is that in the entire world, I believe that, you know, there are two kinds of people. First, those who know that they are victims of cybercrime, and the others don't know yet that they are victims of cybercrimes. So naturally, all are victims of cybercrime. It's only the realization that makes them understand. And, you know, sometimes there are very small things, a small passing message, a small passing email, as sir has already pointed out, it's just a small click, or probably, you know, okay, I don't respond to this, that's it, it's done. I've just clicked it once, nothing will go wrong. That kind of an attitude sometimes lead to trouble. So we naturally say that please get it, you know, get any device or get any communication media forensically analyzed. It's not like every single time you're going to lead to a very huge trouble, but the sense of it is more important. I mean, I must say this, that, you know, nature has gifted us with too many brilliant attributes. Women are like that, like, you know, as they say, they have a very brilliant developed sixth sense. They know when a man, you know, tries to be offensive towards them. It's the same thing. If I don't feel comfortable in opening one email or opening any device, I should restrict myself. It's just that simple control, mental control. If that is not observed, it is going to lead to trouble. And mind it, gone are the days when people were experimenting about their devices. Today, I feel it's the right time when we should do two things. If I know, then only I use it. If I'm not very sure that, you know, probably I know 30% of my device, well, then I am an idiot who is exposed to 70% of risk. It's not about knowing 30%, it's about projecting your risk or adding to your risk by 70%. And here I would like to quote one thing, that it's the time that if government or policymakers are thinking about it, that why there are so much of highly technical crimes happening, I think now we should do something with respect to the consumer awareness also. See, how many of us know that, if it is a device, if let's say, take an example, the luxurious most, because I still treat a mobile phone or an iPhone or probably, computers or laptops as luxury. And if I say luxury is also car, for any car to be, sold in India, we have ARAI. We say that Automotive Research Authority of India would give it a license and say, okay, this is tested, this is okay, this device you can use it on Indian roads, right? That's what we do on cars. Why there is not a single authority which could say that this device, this practice, this utility, it's safe in India? There is nothing like that. Now this is where the law should think over, or lawmakers should think over, that we are projecting certain services to you, communication media to you. We should be looking at it. So my response in those circumstances would be, actually now it is the time. It's not about just one single case. It's about holistically how we are looking at devices and where are the loopholes. Understandably, I think when a case comes, probably the first thing I would say is that, okay, please get yourself to that practice that you are not doing the same mistake again. If I know my dog barks, if I know my dog bites, I should chain it. It's exactly the same thing. Devices are not far away from your pets. You have to take care of them. You have to be sensitive towards them. And naturally, if you're not understanding, see, self-medication would always lead to side effects. Same thing here. Nobody will have any mercy once you are, contributing that negligence to the devices. So naturally, if it is going wrong, I would say just shut that device off and give it to a forensic analysis. That would be my response.
Very good, sir. Actually, as sir said, and I continue from there only, sir said that we have to treat our devices well, and most of the time we don't know that the case we are vulnerable, and sometimes as Ricosta said also said that most of the cases doesn't get reported because people do not want to go to the police station. As we know, we also have attitude, but as you are an additional DGP, I will say that why is it important for people to report as soon as possible? If I say ask in case of cybercrime, they should not wait for any longer.
Well, the experience has been a bit different now. See, if one were to go by statistics, in Pune itself, in the year 2018, 5,523 applications were filed with the cyber police station, but not a single case was registered. 2019 it rose to 7,793, of which 29 cases were registered. In 2020, 14,950 applications were filed, 46 cases were registered, and 2021, that is the current year, 10,895 cases applications were handed over, of which only 39 cases were registered. Now it's a matter for research as to why the number of cases registered vis-a-vis the number of applications received is so low. It has to really be seen. So there could be a variety of reasons for that. Some of these may not actually be cognizable offences under the Act. So if it's not a cognizable offence under the Act, then maybe no case would be registered. There could be other situations wherein the complainant himself is not really interested in prosecution. He seeks some sort of relief. And he says, if I get that relief, then I might not really wish to proceed with the prosecution, because prosecution entails giving evidences in courts and all that. And generally, as you know, we Indians are extremely wary of court, kacheri and giving evidences. So he said, mera ye gaya hai, just give it back to me, I lost my money, this has happened, so give me relief and I'll be happy about it, and I don't want to actually pursue a case. And maybe the cyber fellow too would be more than glad to oblige, because then his crime figures also don't go up so much. And secondly, as I mentioned here, see, now successful prosecution though it happens to be the need of the hour, are we really capable of doing it? Not that we are not capable of doing it, but then it is something that really requires very high professional standards on the part of everyone. Because as it's very rightly said that in order to prove a crime in the court of law, the standard of evidence has to be higher than what it is in civil matters. It is said that the case has to be proven beyond reasonable doubt. So if the defense lawyer happens to create a doubt in the mind of the judge regarding the integrity of the digital evidence that has been introduced in the court, then that is enough to derail the entire prosecution and for the case to fall flat on its face. So, but having said that, I think we should strive hard to secure convictions too, and let's hope and pray that in the days to come. See what had happened. I'll compare this situation with the economic offences being also. See, long years ago, economic offences, though they were being reported in sizable numbers, possibly met the same fate. I mean, the quality of investigation, the standard of evidence collection, and also, filling up the missing gaps that would eventually lead to conviction didn't happen. But now we have very strong, robust economic offences being all over the state. We have an ADG sitting in Mumbai, a joint CP in Mumbai. The ADG is for the whole of the state, the joint CP is for Pune city, plus deputy commissioners herein. So I think the day is not far, given the gravity of the situation, to have very robust. Now there is only a single cyber police station which is handling 10,000 applications. So I think now the cyber cells will have to proliferate. One possibly might need to think of having a separate cyber investigation unit in every single police station, because the numbers are going to go up. Take it from me, these won't come down. And as somebody very rightly said, that only fools commit thefts, robberies and dacoities. A smart one either commits economic offences or cyber offences. So now more and more people are getting smarter by the day, and so I think the unit needs to proliferate. The unit needs to hone its skills. We have to have more of professional investigators, and I'm sure this will happen.
Now, sir, Saral DeCosta, sir, I will come to you and ask. We have understood about the investigation. The evidences are very fragile. Now, what is after the evidences are collected properly, sealed properly in a very good scenario, textbook scenario? So what will happen? What is digital forensics, and when it goes to the forensic lab, what happens, and how it helps? A proper evidence helps to get to the who has committed the crime.
Actually, it's a very good question, but then to deliberate it in a very simple way. First and foremost, the collection of evidence, it has to be done through a form that is called a chain of custody. So the chain of custody has to properly synthesize and say that from what device it has been collected, the date and time. It has to be properly documented. Most of the cases, somewhere, the devices are being examined first, and then the chain of custody is being made. And there have been many instances of this nature. Now, any of these particular evidences which has been seen before, the integrity is a big question mark later on, which could be raised by the defense. Number two, and the most important part, as what is rightly being said, is that generating a hash value. It's a must. The reason why it is a must, although it is not been prototyped or it is written that it should be, but it is a must now, what the court emphasizes it. What happens is that whenever any digital device is being taken into custody, and when it has been sent to the forensic lab with a proper chain of custody being there, the forensic lab in turn, first and foremost, would just check if the, suppose for example, the hard disk is been sent to the forensic lab. They will first check whether a hash value has been calculated or generated for that device which has been sent to the forensic lab. If the hash value has not been generated or it has not been calculated, once again through a software or a hardware. Let me tell you, this software or a hardware should be a legal copy and not a pirated version. If it is a pirated version, always the onus, the defense will make an issue out of it. So once it goes to the forensic lab with a chain of custody, and if there is no hash value being calculated or generated for all that particular documents which is there in that device, the forensic lab in turn will send the complete material back and say that the hash value has not been generated or been calculated, which means that whatever you have sent to me is a question mark, and based on which the forensic lab may not certify that particular device which has been sent to them. So the first thing is the hash value has to be calculated or generated across. Number two, as I can tell you that we are all sitting up over here, and we say that there is a digital piece of an evidence which is basically maybe a WhatsApp chat, maybe a messenger chat. To give you a small example point of view, today the WhatsApp chat, when presented in the court, is being taken as a gospel truth. WhatsApp claims that it is end-to-end encrypted. Well, I don't want to debate from the technical perspective, because I myself say and can emphasize that it is end-to-end encrypted, no doubt about it. But if you look from a legal perspective, a message which has been sent on a WhatsApp can make to be looked as a cognizable offense. For example, you can send a message chat to me. For example, a message comes from Advocate Swapnil to me, I want to meet you. But on my device, it can be shown that the message which has come from his number to me is, I want to kill you. Meet and kill are two different things. And I can go to the whole world, I can go to the police, I can go to Mr. Raman and say, sir, I have been, this particular part, Advocate Swapnil has threatened me, and I thought he wants to kill me. And that's it. Because for the police, it happens, yes, it is a cognizable offense. And under that point of view, the IO will just take a printout of my WhatsApp chat. He will just look on my device, yes, it's there, because I am a complainant, so he won't seize my device mostly. He will seize the device of the accused in this particular matter and say, yes, send it to the forensic lab. But while it has been sent to the forensic lab will take its own course of time. Till that time, Advocate Swapnil will say, no, I have not sent it, I have not sent it. The police in turn may get in touch with WhatsApp. WhatsApp will just give a 2-page liner. Ours is a virtual server, and therefore we don't store any data. Now, under these circumstances, proving now is the job of the accused. And it is known, the complainant knows. Actually, in the court, I would never say that the trial is taking place between the complainant and the accused. It is the judge who is on the trial over there to know the truth, whether the complainant is right or whether the accused is right. So under these particular circumstances, it is very important for the police, for the IO to ascertain that the piece of a paper which has been given to him or to her is a factual one or it is a modified one. So the best way, as what Mr. Raman says, I go with that particular statement, is that under these circumstances, it is rather than taking a section 65B along with the printout of that electronic evidence, it is better to seize the device, that is the primary device, no section 65B certificate required, directly send it to the forensic lab with a questionnaire. Now what questions to be sent is another question mark. Your questionnaires could not be very generic in nature. What is this type of device? The question should be pertaining to the crime which has taken place, the FIR which has been registered. It should be only on that particular perimeter. And under that circumstances, if the IO asks to the forensic lab that in the FIR it has been stated that there has been a chat which has been generated from this number to this number. So does the accused mobile has this chat? Point number one. Point number two. If he or she has deleted it, can you recover it and give it to us? That's the point number two. And the third and the most important thing today in piece of electronic evidence, and that is the message which has come to me that He wants to kill me. I want to kill you. But how this is possible? WhatsApp has not done it. Who has done it? It has been done by the recipient's device itself, because the recipient's device has been rooted. Today the law enforcement agency have to go one step forward and examine the device or ask the forensic lab whether this piece of a device what we are sending to you, is it a rooted one or an unrooted one? What is the difference between that? A rooted device means that the laptop or the device, that is a mobile phone, which has been sent to the forensic lab for an examination, is compromised. The security features of that device has been compromised, so messages can be modified, messages can be misconstrued, messages can be changed, so on and so forth. This question is very important, but I have yet to see any of the IO writing this particular question or asking for a particular opinion from the forensic lab that the device what I am sending to you is a rooted or unrooted. If that forensic report says that this device is rooted, which means that the device has been compromised and messages can be changed, modified, so on and so forth. See in the court what happens now. Since I teach the judicial officers, I always tell them, please look, these are the points. If there is any piece of an electronic evidence, specifically say from a mobile phone which has been produced in the court, first thing, the device which is being produced is primary in nature, number one. Number two, chain of custody, whether it has been maintained with proper parameters. Point number three, if it is from the mobile phone, whether the question is asked whether it is rooted or unrooted. If all of these parameters have been done by the IO, and if you have a report from the forensic lab coming to it, then that piece of an evidence would be appreciated by the court, not only from the circumstantial point of view, not only from the corroborative point of view, but from a conclusive point of view that yes, this was the actual communication which was being made from this device to this device. So these are some of the, some of the ways that how you could find out the truth involved from a digital device. I would sum it up and say that today this digital space is a little scary space from the legal perspective, and therefore just recently the Supreme Court has come up very harshly and saying that the electronic evidence specifically for business communication may not be treated as a conclusive evidence. Why? Because now the court has made it aware of, the judicial officers has now been told that anything what you see on the device, till the time it is being examined, till the time you don't get a report from a forensic lab or a competent authority that it is genuine, please don't appreciate this piece of evidence. Go to your traditional way of finding out the truth, or take a proper feedback, see what the IO has done, take a report from the forensic lab, and then conclude the matter across. So this is how the procedures of the evidence which has been taken by the IO presented in the court, and then the court will start appreciating this evidence, and whatever, whether it is a conviction or whether it is acquittal, would be then decided by the court on the merits of the case.
Sir, you have very beautifully covered the admissibility and reliability of digital evidence also. Now, Swapnil sir, now I would like to start with what is data privacy or information privacy?
See, every time we use devices, we are tending towards that fact that it is my device and whatever is there, it's mine. But see, that's where it is. The individual who is owner of the device or owner of the data inside the device should have that kind of a right over it, because he is the owner of it. Natural it is that if somebody else is having any kind of interface with that, or probably somebody is trying to damage it, destroy it, alter it, or even to an extent delete it, or even for that matter, forget about deleting or destroying, even if somebody is just looking at it without my permission, it would be a breach of privacy in that sense. Practically, there is a very nice connotation that we have under the Information Technology Act, section 43 small a. It says illegal access. Now we have to understand that there are two sets of accesses we talk about. Illegal access in the sense virtual access, that is basically not so physical, where I probably might be living in some other city. From there I might be entering in his or his laptop, probably with some kind of great technical skill. The other way is physical access. Now, naturally, when I say it is virtual access, we are very often leading it to that, you know, somebody is technically so smart. See, he cracked into my computer. Now that's where we start saying that, okay, it is illegal access. It is something what my privacy has been breached up to an extent. But physical access also is something which is coming up really fast, because sometimes it's probably because of curiosity, because of person having, you know, aware that, you know, where you have kept your device or where you have kept your laptop, computers, and he physically tries to have an interface with it. These two things are always recognized under 43 small a. But whether it ends here, the answer is no, it doesn't. Because I personally feel as a law student that gone are the days when we were thinking about privacy very loudly and we used to think that, you know, it exists. For me, the kind of devices what we are using and the kind of network systems that we are using, it is almost turning out to be a ghost. Bhoot hota hai kya? Then somebody might say, I've seen it, so it is there. Then somebody might say, no, dikhta nahi hai, hota nahi hai. Right? I believe that privacy is something like that. How many of us are having, communication media, getting into, you know, that device or that kind of modality? We sign in and we don't even bother to read the privacy agreement. The day on which I was told that I'm supposed to have an email account, and like an innocent person, I just clicked onto it by giving the information saying that yes, I access, I agree, I accept. Gone, my privacy is absolutely gone. It does not exist. Same thing happens with our WhatsApp, same thing happens with our email, same thing happens with any kind of an app that I have on my mobile phone. So what I'm talking about, it's that kind of an area which is universally breached, but personally somebody is cautious of. हम सबको पता है अरमानी हो या कोई और हो, सूट होता है, right? It's a suit. The person would look the way he looks. It's not going to make too much of a difference. But yes, it's all about branding and being cautious. So same way, it's my privacy, so I am obsessed with it. It's all about, I am sensitive about it, so I am looking at it. But practically, whether it exists, I would say hardly it exists when it is a, you know, complex kind of a communication media. As sir has already said that, you know, we want to believe that WhatsApp is end-to-end encrypted. Good, wonderful. We want to believe, so, you know, there is a positive side of it to say that yes, it exists. But some of them, they are going beyond it to prove a communication. I think much has been done, much has been said about, you know, the things which were there in the investigation and in the limelight in the recent past. Let it be something what happened where the whole country was watching, something like Sushant Singh's case. You know, the WhatsApp chats between some people. Now, if one says that yes, investigation was able to produce that, we have yet to see, you know, it's still matter pending, we have to come out with the final investigation. Still we are having that scene where we say that yes, it has been produced in the evidence, or this has been, you know, part and parcel of investigation. Naturally it has been, you know, at least analyzed, at least been viewed, at least been searched. So I cannot guarantee that any kind of a media would not have any digital print behind it. So for me as a law student or as a person who is looking at the technological devices, I believe definitely privacy is a very big right, but whether it exists in all circumstances, I have no guarantee for it. And see, legally also for investigation agencies, you need to give that added advantage. Raman sir has already talked about it, that, you know, we have to prove the case beyond reasonable doubt. Now, if I say I am committing a crime through my device, which is a smartphone, which is a laptop, which is a LAN network, and I am not giving the opportunity for the investigation to have search and seizure, we have to admit that it would end nowhere. Police would just come, investigate, and give a summary report saying that we are not able to find out, we are not able to fix up the liability. That would start happening. And that is the reason, probably under Section 5 of Telegraph Act, we already have a provision for surveillance. We know Supreme Court also approved it in 1997's decision, PUCL. Subsequently, again, when we say privacy is respected, it does not necessarily mean that we are not allowing the investigation to conduct search and seizure. Many people, and obviously media has contributed to it, I must say this, that when Puttaswamy's decision came in, everybody was like, privacy is a fundamental right. privacy is now recognized as a fundamental right. Excuse me. As a law student, we have to understand that fundamental rights can be raised only against state, not against private individuals. What about those private companies or those private individuals breaching my privacy? I have no other option but to go to either as a matter of complaint under 43 small a and read it under section 66, where we say that under 43A I can demand compensation, and together with that I can file a criminal case also. So that way, if I say, practically it's a very big area, but complexity of law is that people are not able to draw the lines amongst what kind of privacy that we are talking about. IT Act also talks about a physical privacy, where we say voyeurism is not permissible. Somebody who is captured on the mobile phone or any camera without his permission, and especially when he's clothed or not clothed, or probably some kind of a physical parts of the body being captured without the permission of the person. We've seen so many cases on that suddenly in the mall where there are changing rooms, the camera has been put in. Even on the swimming pools, we had incidences in many cities. There, if we are having the cameras and we are capturing the images of the persons without their knowledge, without their consent, it is breach of privacy too. But again, in legal technical sense, I understand when I have been alerted about it, or if I figured it out. There were many issues, like Fab India issue had come up. Even before that, this somewhere in the city of Pune, I guess, and even in Bombay it had happened that on a swimming pool changing room was there, and suddenly the girl realized that she is getting captured somewhere. She was uncomfortable while changing her clothes. Is it a privacy breach? It is a privacy breach. But see the interesting part, that is criminal. So naturally we have a separate provision for that in IT Act. Naturally, indecent representation of women, Indian Penal Code, those kind of laws would also come into play. So as a law student, I believe that when you asked a question that how do I see privacy, I would say it cannot be seen only from one angle. It needs to have compartmentalization, it needs to have different ways in which I see my privacy. There are differences. Just to sum it up, like I can give an example where a scientist is working on his laptop and an attendant just tries to take a bite of it, that what exactly he's doing on his laptop. A person who has captured with some kind of an intimate photos with his girlfriend or a boyfriend, the servant in the house just tries to open it and see it, or the friend tries to have an access to it. See, there is a difference in two occasions, right? One where I say that physical intimacy has been seen, that kind of photograph has been captured. It's a choice of two people who say that it's our life, we will decide what has to be clicked with us, and somebody else is breaching into it. Will it be breach of privacy? Yes, it would be. Is it illegal access? Yes, it is. But then, when I relate it to somebody like a scientist working on his laptop, probably I would say, yes, it's not just merely a breach of privacy, but it's also a data theft in a way. It's also something like, patent breach or something like that. So naturally, there would be too many aspects in privacy, and unfortunately, legally, it's been seen differently. Media sometimes hypes the half-baked cookie as if it is a full cake, or the Maryland way they go, and they start thinking that yes, now we know that fundamental privacy is recognized because of Puttaswamy's decision as a fundamental right. But please understand this, that we cannot take away the power of search and seizure from the police. It's available in Telegraph Act also, it's available in the IT Act also. In fact, for me, as a law student, it's a matter of kind of a sea change that we have brought in, that even though the respect towards right of privacy is increasing judicially, we are also putting reasonable burden on both police as well as the investigating teams as well as the individuals. So suppose I do not cooperate now, if Ramanand sir has a doubt that on my phone there is something illegal happening, or I am committing some kind of an illegal thing, I cannot tell him that, see, you might be a police officer, Puttaswamy's decision has come and it is right to privacy, it is my phone, I will not give it to you. I can do that. Because in Information Technology Act, if I don't assist him in investigation and I don't make my phone available for him, that would also relate to section 69. Again, it will bring me into another net, which is basically the copy of section 5. 69 is not different, it is almost like section 5 of Telegraph Act. But in Telegraph Act, we don't have punishment. In 69, we have punishment. So those who are banking on too much of privacy have also to realize that privacy is a connoted right which is at a particular zone. Beyond that zone, there is nothing like recognition of privacy beyond doubt, right? So we have to understand in what areas we are talking about privacy. Privacy is not universal, and that's the reason I said it is a ghost. You might not be knowing that somebody has breached your privacy, and also there is a possibility somebody with an authority of law might intervene into your privacy. So there are two different ways to look at it. The personal space will always be guarded. Wherever there is legal enforcement, there is no privacy. And obviously, the things what we have consented to, there is no privacy at all. So that would be my answer to it.
So now I'd like to ask you that what is basically data privacy bill which has recently introduced, and also give us a few glance of GDPR.
Okay. See, data privacy bill is introduced, but as we say, the bill needs to be enacted. It's a process. See, since 2006, we had the bill pending about data privacy. In Indian Information Technology Act, we had two provisions. One is 43 small a, which I have just answered, and there is one more, which is 43 capital A. Now, the provision under capital A, 43 capital A, it says that if any body corporate is having any personal sensitive information of the person and negligently it transfers it to someone else, and because of that some kind of damage is caused to the person whose information is stored, that person can demand compensation from the said body corporate. Now, for me, it's an ideal situation of saying that tomorrow any kind of a telephone network service provider or any service provider for that matter has breached my information, shared it with someone else, and now I have been involved in such an uncomfortable, annoying situation which has resulted into some kind of a loss to me. Do I have any kind of retaliative, defensive action against such an act? The answer is yes. We have 43 capital A. But it was found out after a point of time that it is not sufficient. Why? Because unfortunately what has happened is that it's not the fault of the investigation, it's not the fault of the practically the lawyers or the parties involved in it, or even neither is the fault of the investigators. But I always felt that it is a problem in terms of adjudication of such things. Why? Because what has happened is that all these things that we are talking about, the privacy breach and all, unless and until it is falling into the chapter 11, 65 to 74, those sections, it would naturally turn out to be civil actions. And in civil actions, what is happening is that there is no compositely appointed competent court at every single place. In civil areas, in civil law functionality, when we talk about these kind of cases coming in, they would go to adjudicating officer. And I must say this on record that for last 20-21 years since we are using this Information Technology Act, there have not been a commendable process, legal process followed at the level of adjudicating officers. Reason being, if you keep on making an area a quasi-judicial one, where a secretary of IT or probably somebody at a levels of ministry, and you want them to be just one single authority in one full state, it would be a big disaster. Just take an example of state of Maharashtra. I mean, gone are the days when we were just saying that Pune is an IT city and Mumbai is capital, so commercial city, commercial capital, and only these two cities will have IT intrusion. Well, now it's somewhere in some remote villages of probably east of Maharashtra, probably somewhere in Gondia district or probably in Vidarbha's last corner, where some issue regarding 43 or something in relation to a company breaching into the data of the person might occur. And what we are expecting, adjudicating officer who is sitting in the ministry in Mumbai, probably once in a month will address the case. So what you want? A person from Gondia travel right away from Gondia to Maharashtra, which is, Mumbai, which is almost like, 18, 19 hours, and then file a case and then just wait for his turn to get compensation. Not going to happen. Naturally, at civil level, we have to devising ourselves very fast, we have to amend that law very fast, and instead of saying that the privacy has been breached and now we don't have a solution for it, reverse the things. Give the jurisdiction to those courts which can really lead it to. And see, IT Act says that unless and until the case is filed for compensation for beyond 5 crore rupees, you're not not going to competent court, you are not going to district court. So that means either I have to raise my claim so high which is unrealistic, or I have to restrict myself to, okay fine, I'll go to Mumbai and then file the case. So unfortunately, that is where the companies are, those companies which are involving themselves into these kind of practices, where they can easily, by way of probably a catch file or probably with the consent of the concerned user, would take the privacy for granted and just breach it at their will. And then if it is resulting into the loss of the person, it's not about law not having the provision for this. The problem is procedurally it is very difficult to raise the claim because it is sitting in the adjudicating officer's domain. So for me, breach of privacy in terms of these situations under 43 is losing out its teeth because we are not properly figured out how to carry on with the jurisdiction. Rather than saying that law doesn't have anything, I would say, see, cribbing about the things that what we don't have won't make a sense. I am a kind of a person who would say, if I am not having water in the tap, I will change the tap. I will go to some different tap. Right? Why should I cry that this tap does not have a water? I should change my balti. वो balti लेके मुझे दूसरे जगह जाना चाहिए where there is water. So practically, for me, as a law student, privacy is a very big issue. Breach of privacy is even bigger issue. But at the same point of time, I have to draw lines. Okay, how do I see it? What are my remedies? Only civil remedy if I want, only compensation if I want, probably data protection and privacy. Data protection and any other jargon of illegal access won't be working out that well. Much has been said about it, but I still feel that under 43A, personal action for data protection can be taken, and 43 capital A, it can be taken against a company. So we have to have some kind of probably gelling of some synchronization probably in terms of actions where we are making it possible for the individual actions even in case of data protection through 43. Something of that sort would be a right way unless and until we improvise our adjudicating systems. If that doesn't happen, then we are still in the soup. And as far as GDPR is concerned, I believe all IT companies are now very much complying with it. But what the law expects, see, it is basically global data protection regime. That is what we are looking at. See, we are known for last 2 decades as country providing highest possible IT services to the entire world. So naturally, there are companies outside India who were trying to, give the processing work as a matter of outsourcing to Indian companies. And that's where the problem came in because, it was too remote. If somebody who is sitting in the Belgium, his service is provided by a US company through a data server or probably the processing unit sitting in Pune, probably the Belgian individual might not even know that from Pune his information has been breached because the server is located probably in Singapore and service is being utilized in Belgium through a US company and data server is here in Pune. It was chaotic. So what these companies came up with, especially the Europeans, that we will have a proper set of data protection regime rules where we demand not the companies but the governments to have a compliance or a data protection officer. DPOs should be appointed. And these DPOs should ensure that these companies who are working in the field of outsourcing are complying with certain set of procedures, certain set of SOPs. If they are not doing it, then we will not allowing them to have an outsourcing work done at those companies. And that's where the whole scenario changed. Majority of the IT companies are on their own made to have compliance with data protection laws. So basically this is how internationally it is an affecting subject matter. And it's not India. There are many other countries also who are affected because of that. And obviously if other countries are sensitive enough about their citizens' rights, and obviously we do not want to label ourselves with chalta hai kind of an attitude. It is better that the companies are coming ahead and they are complying with those DPOs and get their companies audited through proper compliance officers and auditors. It would reduce the burden of cases probably all around the country, all around the world, and at the same point of time we will make out a space for ourselves. We are already known to be an IT nation. I believe that if we properly comply with that, it would again be a safe place for other countries, and they would also give credit to India that it's not just IT country, producing maximum number of software technology and all, but also they will say this is the most safer place in the whole universe to be when it comes to IT. So with that perspective, we should look at GDPR. That would be my answer to it.
Okay, sir. So I think we can conclude with that. We need more responsible legal journalists and serious legal journalists who don't mess up with certain things. Second, we all need to be aware of what is cyber world. We cannot just guess and run around, and we need to be more aware of what we are doing right now and how our past will affect our future.
Yes, absolutely.
So we are all vulnerable, and we are still, IT is a field which is growing and we are also learning from it. And sir, you want to give any advice to the audiences?
It is very important. See, information technology is a technology that will grow by leaps and bounds in the days to come. This field is absolutely dynamic, and it is very important for every single citizen of the country to have at least basic awareness of certain facts, so that he doesn't remain an ignorant or illiterate in respect of these matters. So one should not, take it as something superfluous, and go about understanding it, at least the basics of it. That was what I wanted to say.
See, the gamut of the internet space, the cyberspace, it, as I said, it's not been safely guarded. When we talk about the internet, it has got some 13 root servers, and 10 are in US, the 11th one is in Netherlands, 12th one is Sweden, and the 13th one is in Japan, which clearly gives an idea that when Indian, when he surfaces the net, somewhere the information is also going to one of these countries, whether it is encrypted or not encrypted. We are not yet ascertained it, because as what was rightly being said, that there is no agency yet appointed to find out where the data is going, to which country it is been going and coming, so on and so forth. So I would say that every single citizen, specifically say from our country to start off with, should be safeguarded to ensure that they use the system for a betterment and not misuse it. Now, there are many of them. Of course, you could say the 99% of the people use the technology for a good purpose, but there is a 1% who can make this 99% people vulnerable. And to that extent, as I said before, cyber hygiene practices is the must. In our mythological books, in Ramayana, we had that Ravan. So, in today's particular context, we have that Ravan, but a Ravan is the smartphone. And how we can make the smartphone to work effectively, just like Lord Ram, if you take it in that way. Every particular user who uses technology should have a firewall in place. In the mythological books, we had Lakshman Rekha, but now in today's particular context, that Lakshman Rekha is been christened with a new name that is called as a firewall. So every single person should have a legally obtained copy of a firewall to be installed in his or her mobile phone to ensure that he or she doesn't get victimized on a larger plateau of becoming a victim. That's one point, firewall. Number two, to ensure that your mobile is not infected with some malicious program like virus, worms, so on and so forth. Every single user should have his or her mobile phone installed with a good quality legal copy of an antivirus. And once you have an antivirus to be installed, I'm not saying that you are 100% immunized. I'm not saying that. But to an extent of 99% if you are getting immunized, I would say that the victimization would become far, far less. Number three, and that's what I feel so, that what should be envisaged, and that is awareness among the people has to be told. Must. I can tell you in one of the districts of Maharashtra police, there's a senior police inspector who seldomly is there in his office. Most of the time he goes to the institutions and especially talks to the youngsters and telling them about cyber awareness. I would feel that if the law enforcement agency have their own training cell and if they go in the dress, I know that during the pandemic it's now not possible to have a contact session, whenever this pandemic will get over. So if the police officer goes to an institute, because that is a most marginalized sector which could be affected the most, as well as they could inflict most of the particular problems also. And if at all a law enforcement person goes in a college, goes in an institution and talks to them that such and such incident happened, I was handling a case, such was the misery of that person, how that particular misery could be averted out. So I think this awareness could make a lot of particular cyber crimes to be minimized to a large extent. Till today, every day, I see this senior police inspector sending at least one message to me that he's got a program at this. Now, of course, it's a webinar. But I feel very happy to say, I asked him one question, how much time you spend in your police station? How much time you spend in your office? He said, hardly 1 hour. The rest of the time, only in webinars, making awareness. And the net result, what has happened, that in his particular district, the cyber crimes have become less. It might have less become 8 to 10%. It's a start. It will move on, and at one time, the cyber crimes will be minimized to a negligible figure. You see, just like a COVID, you know, the infections go on larger. Then we have got some certain practices, protocols to be followed, creating awareness among the people. Once this is there, automatically the figures go down across. And last but not the least is the IT Act. The time for amendment has come, because I could say it's a toothless wonder. The time has come that the IT Act has to be amended, because the last amendment took place in 2008 and that's almost 13 years. And technology has risen from X level to 20 times more X. So under this perspective, the criminals should not find that, okay, this law is an endless tooth. You know, it doesn't have any of those particular fixtures to have me arrested is okay, but not at the end of the day, not leading any conviction to me, I will be just free about it. So this act has to be amended to ensure that the people are not getting victimized. And most of the crimes today which have been orchestrated by the misuse of technology has to be governed in these particular IT Act, such as the people will not get to be having a fear of using this technology. I'm sorry to say that I said that a mobile phone is a Ravan of the 21st century, but I say with full application of a mind, because the amount of cybercrimes which are increasing, the time will come that people will be scared using this particular device, because potentially every single user has got a chance to be victimized by the misuse of technology. I would say that potentially, when you talk about the COVID, I'm not a doctor, from a medical doctor, but you said that one COVID patient can infect 8. But I would say that one hacker can infect 10 crore people. So I think there is the time, there is the part that we should tell this criminal, look, if you are doing some illegal activities, we are going to catch you, there is a police who is going to catch you, and you will be treated with such type of a punishment which will be difficult for you to prove that you are innocent, so on and so forth. And companies, organizations should invest in technology. And people also should invest. You are buying a mobile phone costing 40,000-50,000 rupees. 400-500 rupees for an antivirus firewall to be installed in a mobile phone is a petty thing. It's not that something which is a very big money, where you can make your mobile secure, your life secure, your personal and your professional life will be safely guarded by you itself, and not allowing a third person to peek into your professional and personal life and make the life to be a vulnerable.
Well, in my opinion, I think I just give a basic instance. One of that is, I think just 1 or 2 years back, one of my friends who is in US has sent me a picture where some people are guarding some place. And I asked him, what is that picture all about? He says it's some big company's Google's server where they are guarding it. So I said that tells us the picture, that the world's largest software or the world's largest IT company has people with guns to protect it. There's nothing but much to say actually. See, it's vulnerable world out there. You might get a kind of a basic threat about certain things. Suddenly it makes a news in the newspapers that some asteroid is going to hit you. some geographical phenomena is going to cause too much of flood, too much of global warming they talk about. I think if you are serious about those things, please be serious about these things too. It is a very, very vocal picture, I believe, that IT companies' server room is getting guarded with gunmen. I don't need to say that even the biggest of the companies and biggest of the servers, dealing companies needing the protection which is more physical than digital. It's a very simple thing. I was in Germany a few years back where there was written something in German, and I asked my fellow professor, my invitee, to just tell me what exactly has been written over it. So it said that any system is as strong as its weakest link. This is how it is. So it is basically when Pakistan attacked us with Patton tanks, everybody believed that Patton tank is the best tank. It cannot be losing in the war. Well, there was Abdul Hamid who figured it out. The bottom is all shallow. It's very easy to attack it. Please be cautious. You might make a wonderful thing, a very, very protective thing. It's all about getting yourself exposed with the risk. As Haran sir has rightly said, that it's all about coronavirus, knowing it, that it's going to affect many at a same point of time. The same way, the only ultimate thing what you have in your hand is take care, be safe, right? Just know what you are doing. Don't be so shallow in your approach while dealing with technology because it's easily available. We are the country where we are having, I think, probably more number of mobile phones than toilets. So, I mean, you cannot take it for granted that, because it is easily available, nothing will go wrong. Rather, it's the potential threat with the individuality and commonality. So with that, I think I should pray that every one of us and obviously the next generation should be in safe cyber world. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Srilin Ramanan sir, Harold DeCosta sir, Swapnil Bangali sir, for giving us this awareness and giving us this opening for such a big horizon to be aware and to be safe, and what can be done if we get by chance unsafe. And it all takes a one attack, successful attack against our 100 defenses to get attacked. And I thank Deepak sir, Chancellor of this university, Geetali Tilak ma'am, Vice Chancellor, for giving us this opportunity for this talk. Thank you so much.